Well, I am in the San Antonio Art League Museum, and this morning I thought I would take you on a tour of the work in the museum, this show that is actually in a way a retrospective of 40 years of work. And I'm upstairs in the gallery, which is where the older work is. And I thought I would start chronologically. And so this piece is probably the oldest piece in the show. This is Tumbling Box. And the background is entirely hand dyed and printed. And it was of the era when I was first learning about surface design. And so you can see it's heavily stamped and printed and entirely, I can't believe I did it, quilted in gold metallic thread. And the blocks, the actual tumbling blocks, and you know that's a takeoff on an original traditional pattern. The tumbling blocks are actually made from hand-painted and dyed lutradur. This piece is a combination of actual photocopy transfers. Those are all applied using Citrusolve. It's on a silk background. And then I went in and did this hand embroidery over some of the black and white elements that were there. Another example of that. The center of the piece is divided by black sand, and that image, this is meant to be kind of a meditative piece, and so that black sand element is definitely right in the middle of the piece, which isn't always what we think of as the best place for a focal point. The fabric on the right is a print from spruce, and that is a spoonflower fabric. And then that also includes some hand embroidery and needle felting in that small fruit. The next piece is also an older piece, and by that, 1992. And this one is, again, hand-painted background, and this began as a drop cloth. And that's maybe a claim to fame for me, is that frequently my pieces begin as drop cloths on the table. And this is from that same period. The rectangles across the bottom are lutradur, as are the kind of exploding yellow and red-orange shapes in the middle. And this one's called Organizing Chaos. A little bit of a close-up. This is another piece from that same era. And I was very interested in adding things to the actual surface, and so this mixed media approach has been one of my interests for quite some time. You can see the lutradur shapes again at the bottom, those squares. And this was another example of a piece that started on the drop cloth. And it has actually tomato netting stitched to the surface and tied. And then you can see also that it is machine quilted. And those are real stones. Many of these pieces were really what I thought of as meditations. And I used E6000 to apply the stones. This piece is from 2002. It's called Two Sides to Every Story. It's two translucent layers with a layer of felt that has cut out shapes in between. So it is actually a quilt, it is a sandwich, but this was during a period when I was very, very interested in paper lamination. So you can see that the grid on this piece is a combination literally of paper, newspaper, and then also some paint. And then this is Joss paper, and it's a metallic paper. It's a little hard to see that it's metallic in this light, but you can see those lighter shapes are actually the translucent areas in the quilt, and the more opaque parts are the grid of felt that's in between. If we go around this piece, you'll see why it's referred to as two sides to every story, because it's a two-sided quilt. Next to it is a piece that's more recent. This piece is based on, actually it is quilt blocks, and in this case the quilt blocks are turned out and fused down so that the seams are exposed. And this is one of the pieces that features the spackling that I've been very interested in using. And you can see it's possible to skim coat the spackling so that you can literally still see the background fabric through the spackling. The coloring on this particular piece was added with Inktense crayons and watercolor. And there's another companion piece here, also that star pattern, and those are superimposed over another background that was a 9-patch, and the white stars are based on the quilt pattern, and you can see those are printed. So I've approached using quilts a number of different ways, obviously, sometimes with the seams turned out, and sometimes, as is true in this particular piece, with the seams turned in a more traditional configuration. This piece is called Uneasy Transition. And it's a set of log cabin blocks. Those of you who know your quilt blocks will recognize those at the bottom. And those are gradually turning into the 9-patch, which is at the top. This piece is continuation of the Quilt Not Quilt series, meaning it was a quilt originally, and now I've transformed it using the spackling, which of course makes it very stiff, and also the gold leaf. And as you can see there, paper, which has been fused to the surface, the little white, that's a combination of gold leaf and white paper that has holes in it. Also true in this portion of the quilt. You can see the handmade papers there. Now we'll transition downstairs and look at a couple other rooms of work. Now we're downstairs in the larger gallery, and we're going to start with this work on the right. And these are pieces from a series called Etudes. And the Etude series was about daily practice and how musicians use daily practices in order to maintain their stamina on their instruments, and how athletes use a daily practice in order to maintain their strength. And in this particular series, I limited the variables by wanting to work in neutrals, actually achromatically, meaning black and white and gray. So I did 4 pieces a week for 10 weeks, and they were all this long, thin sort of format. And each one has a flower paste crackle, which is what you see right there. I limited the tools and the patterns because I really wanted to focus on the feeling that I had of just really getting into the work. And there's another example of using the black sand. And then these also incorporate some hand stitching. Here's another one. This one's called Larghetto, Cultivating Patience. And another feature of this series is that they frequently included pieces of clothing that had been dyed and hand painted. You can see there the buttons are still included in the composition. This one's called Etude number 16, Metamorphosis. In this particular week, I got really wanting color. Just was really missing using color. So I let myself use some of the color that was on the, guess what, the drop cloth. And in this particular instance, I was also playing with using rice paper and mulberry paper that was fused to the surface of the fabric. The black rings, the sand, once again, pages from a book. And then I was also beginning to explore burnout, which allowed me to create this checkerboard shape by burning away some of the rice paper with one of the chemicals that I use. This is Love Song for Zenna. That heart is black sand, and that's actually a heart that Zenna drew when she was probably 5 or 6 years old. And I still have the silk screen and use it. That's another example of a piece that incorporated a lot of burnout of the paper applied to the surface. Another in the series, this one's called Cultivating Perseverance. And this is an example from the series of pieces that not only incorporate clothing, you can see another sleeve on the left in this one, but also pattern pieces fused to the surface. Misty Fuse is my best friend sometimes. All of the images that you see in this case, for example, the leaves, are hand-drawn and turned into thermofax screens. And then this one, of course, also has cheesecloth fused to the surface and a little bit of a vintage textile. This one's called Embraceable You. I listen to a lot of Ella Fitzgerald when I work, and I love her songs. I love her voice. I love everything about her. This one turned that little piece of shirting into a little house. And once again, you see the burnout used with the rice paper. More of the clothing, this particular piece, Marking Time, Solitude. And you can really get a sense of the patterning from the flower paste, that black crackle, and then of course the hand stitching and the cheesecloth applied to the surface. Right up above that is one called Open Heart, and the same basic elements, the flower paste crackle, the dress patterns, the clothing, and the black sand. On the back wall here is a piece called Delicate Balance. Delicate Balance is vintage quilt blocks from the 1800s, beautiful silks, combined with paper in order to fill out the log cabin pattern there on the right. You can see again the use of the spackling, so you can literally decipher what's underneath, although it is kind of hidden in the layers. And one of the things I loved about this particular set of blocks is that the basting stitches are still part of the configuration. Its companion piece is X. X marks the spot. And it's more of those same Victorian quilt blocks. See how beautiful the silk and the plaids are, and the spackling over the surface, and then some hand stitching. And on the opposite wall, 6 more of the Etudes. On the other end of the gallery are pieces from a series from 2011, and these are all pieces from what I called the Sacred Planet series. And these are pieces that were made from my original photographs. I took the photographs in a number of different natural history museums, and then I had them printed by spoonflower.com, and I assembled them. The whole point of this series was to use patterns that are human patterns, like these maps, superimposed over the natural patterns that we find in nature. And the natural patterns that we find in nature include the Fibonacci spiral, of course, and lots of other constructs that have nothing to do with human ordering or systeming. These are all put into patterns that are repeat patterns that are also mirror images. And what happens when you put the patterns into a mirror image, it creates these beautiful patterns, but you don't always notice at first that there are actually fish in the pattern, or there are actually parts of a poppy in the pattern, or that in fact the pattern is based on a photograph of cactus. There you can see the maps superimposed and the charts superimposed. And when you back up from the pattern, you begin to lose the fish, and then you can just enjoy the beauty of the pattern. It's another one of my favorites. On the right is the carp, and you can probably see that. It looks like they're kissing because of how I put them in the pattern. But on the right, not always as easy to decipher, the tiger. The light blue areas that you see in the images are actually the very eerie lighting reflected on the glassed cases that the animals were enclosed in. Another in that Sacred Planet series. Looks very abstract at first, doesn't it? But then when you zero in, you see the moose, and you see the zebra behind the moose. All of those, again, altered considerably because of all the reflections from the glass cases. And then, of course, the map, in this case, a map of northern Canada, which is where those moose, of course, would be native.
Do you need a sweetener? Okay.
One more in that series. This time probably pretty easy to pick out the zebras and the weather chart. All of these pieces have a red line that runs through them, and in the original display of the pieces, the red line connected from one piece to another. And of course, I like to use a lot of symbolism in my work, so that red line represents the thread that connects us all. This one is a human skeleton and the shorebirds. Now we're looking at the most recent work, and these pieces also begin as quilts. This is called East-West, and actually not a quilt per se as much as just the quilt block or the quilt top. And so you can see the pattern through the gold leaf. You can see the floral print that was there. These have paper pieces fused to the surface that repeat and sometimes mimic the fabric shapes. They're gold leafed and then they're also spackled. And then I add printing, and in this particular series, I also added these vintage needlework pieces, which were cut out and fused to the background. So I did not, I hate to admit it, but I didn't do that stitching, but I rescued it and added it to this background. This smaller gallery also has the more recent work in it, including another one from the East-West series. And you can see, in this case, some of the blocks of the quilt were actually covered up so that they wouldn't be gold leafed or spackled, so you get a sense of what the real quilt looked like. And in addition to that, obviously the gold areas that were applied with fusible, and then the denser gold areas which have spackling under them. And again, the fused applique of this shape, which was originally embroidered onto a black silk kimono. There are several other pieces in this room that began as quilt blocks that had never been assembled into a quilt. And in this case, this is a whole series. It's snowball pattern on the left, then another panel, and then another panel, and then over here on the right, an assortment of blocks all assembled together. These were gold leafed and spackled, and then layers of paint put down with thermofax screens. And as you can see, it's a lot of paper. Bible pages and dictionary pages are pretty much what I used on this quilt. And this particular piece is called Transitioning. And to the left of it is one of my favorite pieces called Sentinels. And same basic strategy, quilt blocks assembled over felt, gold leafed, spackled, layers of very sheer paint to build up the pattern and the texture. Some use of iridescent paint, as well as the matte surface. My most recent pieces are these botanical prints, so we're going to get a reflection, so it's a little bit hard to see. These are prints that were literally made from real leaves, and I've been pioneering a number of ways to add background to them. And all of this happens in the steamer as the leaves and flowers, this is a hydrangea, are being steamed. There are 6 of these in this show. This one is also hydrangeas. And the patterning in the background, as I say, was printed and added during the actual steaming process. A third in that series, these are Japanese maple leaves. You can see the blue cheesecloth was used to create that background, and then the gold was laid in afterwards by masking off the leaves and adding the gold leaf. The Botanical Series is really thrilling for me because it means that I can take many of my surface design techniques and literally reinvent them by adding them to the botanicals, the plants. So this is a smoke bush, and that beautiful blue and green color comes directly from the plant, which is one of the most thrilling things about the process, is that you don't know what's going to happen until you do the steaming. This one, again, I apologize. The reflections are a little problematic, but I think you get the sense of that. Again, all the coloring that you see is the leaves itself, or the leaves themselves. And this one is gold leafed around the edges by masking off the plants and then adding the gold as the final stage. Last piece in the show is again one of those pieces that was originally a quilt top with the gold leaf, and this one is part of that series that I called Transitions. So I hope you've enjoyed this little walkthrough and that it hasn't been too distracting to be in a real building with the phone ringing and people talking and music playing, and isn't that what real life is? And all of those things contribute to our wonderfully creative world. So hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. My email address is dunnewoldj@complexcloth.com. You can visit my website for more examples of my work, and all of the work in this show was for sale. I've had some wonderful sales. If you see something you really like and you want to own it, please write me an email and we'll work it out.